In terms of the damage a no-deal Brexit could bring the UK.
Nadeem Baba there. Well, let's get more on the implications of a no-deal Brexit from Geraint Johns, who's Professor of Economics at Lancaster University Management School. Sir, thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. So I guess it's 100 days from now that if there is no deal, then the UK is facing what we're calling a sort of crashing out of the EU. The EU seems to be preparing in some way. What do you think the UK government can do to, I guess, prepare for what many people had hoped would be avoided, but now seems that might just happen?
The first thing to say about the possibility of a no deal is that, according to the government's own calculations, a no deal would be a very bad outcome indeed. And their own calculations suggest that 15 years from now, GDP would be more than 9% lower than it otherwise would be if the UK were to crash out with no deal. And the reason for that is that if we crash out with a no deal, the European Union would have to charge tariffs at the standard rate to the UK, as it does to third countries, because the UK would, of course, become a third country. That would make exports from the UK to the European Union very uncompetitive. That would cause jobs to be lost. At the same time, you've got supply chains that have, over the last 40 years, developed across the border between the UK and the rest of the European Union, and things travelling between the UK and the EU would be interrupted at the border for border checks, for tariffs, but also for regulatory checks. That would slow down, frustrate supply chains. Firms would likely leave the UK for the European Union in order to access that bigger market that there is in the European Union. So a no-deal outcome is a very bad outcome indeed for the UK. And that being the case, very few people want it. It seems that Mrs May and her government are holding this as a possibility in order to try and get some political action from it, to try and get some of the backbenchers, particularly in her own party, the Conservative Party, to support her deal. At the same time, we've had a delay in the meaningful vote in order to run down the clock and make it almost inevitable that people have to choose between no deal and Mrs May's deal. The reality is there are other options out there. People's vote is one thing that has been suggested, or a Norway Plus arrangement is something that's been suggested. And really, the sooner the better we can get to a sensible discussion amongst our politicians of these various options.
But I suppose if you own a small business in the UK, not a big firm that can actually relocate to the EU, but a small business here, and you've probably been watching the politicians over the past few months and aren't particularly impressed. I mean, the whole point of no deal is that no one really prepared for it, because everybody thought, well, it's never going to get to that, because that is the worst case scenario. But what do you think a small UK business, or, businesses here in the UK can do to prepare for it, should it happen?
It's a difficult question to answer because businesses operate in a whole variety of sectors, and no deal will affect different sectors in different ways. But what will affect any firm, including small firms that are trading with Europe, is the export regulations and the import regulations that they face. So every firm will need to have an EORI number. That's an economic operations number that is a bit of bureaucracy that's involved with this. Most firms will go for having a customs broker in order to make their arrangements with the tax office. They'll have to have special tax returns so that the tax man knows what they're importing, what they're exporting, because tariffs will be payable on those. So there'll be extra tax returns to fill. They may also need export licenses. So there's a lot of extra bureaucracy that firms are going to face.
Of course, in the run-up to the referendum, few people spoke about trade in such detail, the way few people spoke about really the whole Irish issue. Immigration really seemed to be the main issue. We've seen the British government effectively unveil its new immigration policy. What role does that play in a potential Brexit? Is it an admission, do you think, by the government that actually, Brexit or no Brexit, the UK still needs immigrants to come and work here?
Britain will certainly need immigrants, and certain sectors will need them more than others. So we know about the agriculture sector when it comes to picking fruit, for example. They may need to recruit immigrants to do that work. And special arrangements would need to be made for that. Also in the health service, certainly in the short to medium term, before people can be trained to do these roles, then there will be a demand for nursing staff, ancillary staff that will need to be plugged by migration, as it has been in the past. And so there'll need to be some windows in the legislation to allow for that to take place.
Geraint Johns, Professor of Economics at Lancaster University Management School. Sir, thank you. Well, with just, as we mentioned, 100 days to go